Hello everyone, this is a quick tutorial or a wait, what am I supposed to be doing? We are talking about graphing grouped frequency distributions. So remember, in a group frequency distribution, the reason that we might have one is because we have categories that are very large, and it's kind of hard to understand. It's not a good summary. So we further summarize these into grouped intervals, and we can lose some information when we do that, just like with any other summary. But the more we summarize, the wider that grouping interval, the more information is lost. To find how we're going to do that grouping on a table, we're going to want to first find the range of that table. Now notice here the range is done the way we calculate range. We do the top number minus the bottom number, and in this case that's 18. Just note that when we're doing this later for our graphing this, we wouldn't just do that subtraction, okay? So just notice that there are 19 numbers there because 0 is a number. Then we're going to kind of come up with what we want those interval sizes to be. And those could be different things depending on what makes sense for the data. In this class, I will always kind of tell you really what I want that group to be. But say that I played around with it and couldn't decide what to do and eventually decided, oh, okay, I'm going to have an interval. I'm going to have 6 intervals with an interval size of 4. And then what we'll do is we're going to make the lower limit of each interval a multiple of that interval size. So if my interval size is 4, then the lower limit of each of my intervals is going to be a multiple of that. So I'm going to have a 4, an 8, a 12, a 16 as those lower limits. What that looks like in a table would be like this. Again, notice I have the lower limit of each interval is a multiple of that interval size. So my 4, my 8, my 12, and my 16 are those lower limits. Remember the guidelines for these is we typically want 10 or fewer. There could be different reasons to have more. We want that interval size to be a relatively simple number. 4 is a pretty easy one. We're all kind of used to that one. Notice we don't have any gaps. So we don't have any gaps between those. Even if we had a big chunk of information in the middle where we had no frequency, we would still include that information because we don't want to have gaps in our intervals. And also notice we don't have any overlap. So 4 is only in one category, 11 is only in one category. And again, we have that interval size is a multiple of the width, and they're all equal size as well. Notice that means that we had to add a 19 to our top interval. Remember, we only had values that went up to 18, but we're going to add that 19 because, again, we want to make sure that all intervals are that same width. And that interval is 4, so again, look at that. 0 is 1, 1 is 1, 2 is 1, 3 is 1, so we have, that gives us 4. Remember, we can count on our fingers to kind of indicate those. When we're going to graph this information, we're going to need to come up with a midpoint for each of these intervals to graph them. So again, for our graph here, we have each of those intervals, and remember that the interval size is what we're going to base that midpoint on. And this is where that is different than calculating that range. So that range, remember, we took 18 minus 0, and that was fine, right? The top number minus the bottom number. Here, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do 3 minus 0, 7 minus 4. We're going to subtract the low value from a low value from the above interval. And so in this case, the easiest one to do is 4 from the second interval minus 0 from the first interval. That gives us an interval size of 4. Again, you can just count up the numbers that are in each interval. 0, 1, 2, 3. That's 4 different numbers in that interval. Again, you could also just subtract 4 minus 0. This is our interval size. If you haven't calculated the interval yourself, you would need to do this. If you already had kind of come up with a table like we did previously, you wouldn't need to do this. You would already know what your interval size was. Then we're just going to divide that interval size by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, and we'll just add that low value to the interval, to the low value of each interval. So we'll take our 0 and we'll add 2 to it. We'll take our 4 and we'll add 2 to it and we get 6. We'll take our 8 and add 2 to it and get 10, our 12 and add 2 to it and get 14, and our 16 and add 2 to it and get 18. Note, if we have an interval size that's not divisible by 2 into whole numbers, we could have a midpoint that's a fraction, that's a decimal. So if we had an interval size that was 3, we would have 1.5 added to the bottom value of each of those intervals. To graph that, then we're going to put those midpoints on our x-axis. Make sure we're labeling what that represents. We put our y-axis, our frequency, again labeling that. We have a title that tells us what we're interested in, and then we just graph that frequency information from our table. So again, this is just a reminder on how to do a grouped frequency table and how to graph a group frequency distribution. Thanks so much.